Resonance is a peculiar thing, or maybe it's not a peculiar thing, maybe it's our society is a peculiar thing because we're run by corporations who would like to sequester free energy knowledge in order that electrical engineers and mechanical engineers not pursue it in their studies or in their hobby version of experimentation when they're off the job, because they're the most qualified people to get involved with free energy. Yet they're not, because they're taught to stay away from it. They're taught to call free energy unstable. And so consequently, that's not what we want. You won't get paid for creating an unstable circuit. But there is a zone, a lucky little zone. If you can manage to design a free energy circuit to go to this zone, it will strobe like a strobe lantern, in which, it wants to explode, but it also wants to collapse in a periodic manner. And you can get any kind of strobe effect you want, all the parameters, the peaks. You can design the peaks the way you want them, in theory, and the frequency of the occurrence of those peaks, namely the occurrence of the collapse, the periodic collapse. And because of the concept of pulse width modulation, in which you can fake a sine wave. Motors have to have sine waves. AC motors have to have sine waves fed to them. But you can fake feeding a fake sine wave to a AC motor by creating a series of square waves that are close enough that the motor will not know the difference. And this is how motor controllers control the speed of an AC motor, like in a Tesla car or some other electric car, is by faking the sine wave that it constructs out of square waves, that it feeds the motor. Now, I got a little ahead of myself. So there's an interesting aspect to resonance in which electrical engineers and mechanical engineers are not taught. And it's the realm of free energy, the realm of nonlinear dynamics, and it has to do with Foster's reactance theorem, which specifies that you can have negative impedance, just like nonlinear dynamics specifies that you can have the outcome not proportional to the income. In other words, the way they put it in their vernacular, they call the output the signal frequency, and the input they call the pumping frequency. But it's still, the way we understand it, output versus input. But the frequency was the giveaway. Then I knew that electrical reactance was being dragged into the discussion or hinted at without being dragged into the discussion when it should be dragged in. In my dialogue with AI that I have written up in my book on the topic that I put on Amazon and freely available elsewhere. Anyway, so this idea of resonance, the only aspect of resonance that electrical engineers and mechanical engineers are taught concerning it has to do with impedance matching, which is all very well and good if you're trying to increase efficiency. Fine. But a free energy circuit has nothing to do with efficiency. In fact, the circuit that Joseph Newman uses, but did not disclose, Byron Brubaker disclosed it to me, that what I had stumbled upon in my study of Joseph Newman is actually what he had taught Newman. But Newman kept the secret to himself, said God gave him the secret, never gave Byron the credit publicly, and used this updated version, which was over unity, used it for his demonstrations, his public demonstrations. But the older model that Joseph Newman came up with on his own, that was not over unity, that he freely gave away in his book. And I got the 8th edition, and I studied it, I simulated it, and it was not over unity. Oh, just make it bigger, Joseph says. Doesn't work. The only parameter you can change, you can increase it, is the frequency of rotation of his device. But you have to make it so ridiculously fast that it's impossible that a mechanical device could rotate that quickly and not break down. 100,000 cycles per second, that's 6 million RPM. Can you imagine a device that rotates at 6 million RPM in order to achieve the half an ampere reverse current traveling back to the battery pack to top them off to make sure they don't become depleted. And so you've got a perpetual motion machine for all intents and purposes, except for the fact that he was using dry cell batteries that are not meant to be recharged, and so he'd have to replace them. Oops. But that's the way, Joseph Newman, I have to say it, he was a country bumpkin. He had the right intentions, and he had a heart that he knew if he went in a certain direction, he'd get there, but he didn't get there without Byron's help. Well, that taught me something, that if you properly design a circuit, by whatever reason how you got there, if it lacks frequency, it'll be comatose, which is the worst condition because it's not even under unity. It just sits there and hardly any life occurs in that circuit. It's there, but it's not enough to sing about, because there are 3 zones regarding this other aspect of resonance, which first I should define it for you. What it does is it puts resonance in a whole new light, because now it rates it. Because, see, the way I look at Foster's reactance theorem, the way I always described it before I discovered there was something called Foster's reactance theorem that provides for negative impedance and the generation of power within the circuit, the way I call it was overreactance. The circuit overly reacts. Like somebody who gets really emotional over what you and I might consider to be an inconsequential event. But that person is ever so hypersensitive about that type of subject matter, and so they overreact. Or it's something personal, the loss of a son. I've been overreacting ever since. I just try to avoid it and ignore it. But overreactance can be rated, and you can call that a type of resonance because it comes in 3 zones. And when you modify the circuit, either its capacitance or its inductance or its frequency or any combination thereof, you can change the duration by which it takes to reach a certain level of overunity. Let's say your target is 100,000 watts, and yet you're feeding it, microwatts, milliwatts, more likely nanowatts or picowatts. And so how long does it take to get to your target? Does it take 10 million seconds, or does it take nanoseconds, or anywhere in between? And so we can call that a rate and call it 3 types of resonance in which it either explodes in your face if the frequency is too high, or the other factors, the capacitance isn't quite right, or the inductance, or all 3. But the frequency is the easiest to play around with. Once you get the capacitance and the inductance set pretty much where you want it, the only thing left remaining is the frequency to play with. And if you have the frequency too high, it'll blow up in your face. If you have it too low, it'll go comatose. And if it's not properly designed to give you a middle zone in between those 2 extremes, you won't find a middle zone. It'll either explode or be comatose. And that's the story of most electrical engineering these days, is a lack of pursuit for that middle zone in which it strobes. It periodically peaks because it periodically collapses. And hopefully your peaks are not so strong that the circuit becomes destroyed, so it can continue to deliver a very regulated periodicity of strobing, of peaking. Okay? So it wants to explode, but it doesn't have what it takes to go all the way to destroy itself, to reach for infinity, to reach for the stars. Instead, it collapses prematurely in a very... it's not totally duplicated each peak. Sometimes. I mean, let me put it another way. All the time, it's kind of random. But sometimes it's more non-random than others, depending on the orchestration, the design of the circuit. It can be very random, these peaks, in terms of the periodicity may not be very regular. The height of the peak, or the depth, I should say, the extreme of the peak, either positive or negative, away from the midline of 0, can vary. And so you can get these peakings happen in a very weird way, and then you know you don't have the best circuit that you could possibly design. It still calls for improvements. But the irregularity can be so minimal that you hardly notice it, and that's what we want. We don't want the appliance to notice the irregularity of that peaking. But there is a level of chaos there. And I've noticed that if you have a truly over-unity circuit, if you keep running the simulation one time after another time after another time, you'll get slightly different results, and it might cycle itself in a repeatable cycle, let's say, of 4 types of results. They're all over unity, but they're slightly different from each other, which tells you the simulator has kind of got the right idea, but it can't really put its finger on it because it approximates the answer. It doesn't give you, because it uses shortcuts. It's called matrix algebra. I hate it. I never liked it in school, and I don't like it in a simulation because I want precise results. And because of various shortcuts, and that's one of them, it gives you a level of chaos that doesn't need to be there, but it's the simulator's fault. Okay? Now, I may be wrong, because I've never seen a simulator designed specifically for over-unity circuits, and so it may just be an inherent nature of nonlinear dynamics that you will get chaos, whether you like it or not. Hopefully, it's manageable, it's acceptable, it's tolerable because it's minor, hopefully. So this minor zone, so we've got this, so the idea here in resonance is not impedance matching, because the whole idea with free energy is you can have all the energy you want in the world and be as inefficient as you like. And that's why I brought up Joseph Newman, because his device, as Byron advised him to make changes, is anything but efficient. It throws away a tremendous amount of energy, current mostly, that it just throws it away and doesn't bother to harness it. Yet it still is over unity and still is a self-runner, the way we like to call it. Those of us in the know. We don't like to call it perpetual motion. We call it a self-runner until it breaks down. So we want resonance of the type that puts us in the middle zone, and we strobe. Now, a lot of my circuits, I've noticed that I don't get the power level I want to when I get into that middle zone. It strobes, but you end up with milliwatts. And what good is that, you know? You can't run any appliance off of milliwatts, but it strobes. And if I try to raise, change some parameter to raise the outcome, it just wants to go to infinity. And then I say, okay, and then I ease back to the strobe. So it drops back down to the strobe level, and it doesn't save any of the energy that had accumulated when I raised the parameters to increase its power level. It failed, and I find that with a lot of these designs that I come up with, it fails to save the energy that you bothered to raise it past the point of its ability to not, break down as a physical circuit if it had been built. But even under simulation, it doesn't save it. So that's a problem. So it has to strobe at the level that you want it to be at. And that's what I'm working on now in trying to study Paul Falstad's simulator, because here's the deal. Normal simulators run off of the SPICE family of simulators, designed specifically not to strobe very readily. Yet I managed to come up with a design that I call the golden ratio design that does strobe, despite the fact that it only runs in the SPICE version of MicroCap 12, version 12. It's a beautiful circuit. I still don't know how to build it, but it's a beautiful in how you can design it to strobe and be whatever parameter strobing you want, blah, blah, blah. The problem is, with SPICE family of simulators, to come up with some other version of a circuit that will strobe is very hard. In fact, I've never been able to. But in Paul Falstad's, I keep doing it. I keep running across various designs that can strobe. Now, why is it so easy in Paul Falstad's simulator? He does things very different. And some of the reasons for doing so is because he's doing a simulator that it doesn't behave like the Spice Family, in which you set everything up and then you run it and then you look at the results frozen in front of your face. No, Paul wanted a simulator that ran continuously, giving you the output. The circuit is always on, and you can make changes to it while it's running. And that creates a few hazards. Namely, you can create parametric amplification by making any kind of change, in which all of a sudden you get this free energy that wasn't there in the design, but only because you changed the design while it was running. And you got yourself a blast of free energy. That's pretty cool, but that's parametric amplification. And you don't get to do that in the Spice Family of simulators because they don't want you to stumble across parametric amplification. Okay? So it's not a mistake of Paul Falstad's simulator. It's a mistake of maintaining the status quo. And in that regard, yes, his simulator fails to maintain the status quo of ignorance that is pervasive among formally trained electrical engineers and mechanical engineers. God forbid they should stumble across parametric amplification. So that's one way he's a little different from the norm of the Spice Family of simulators that comes out of UC Berkeley. The other thing is that he's got a DC transformer that can pass DC. And I always wondered about this, and I think I may have solved it by successfully modeling it using his air core coils, his singular inductors, in a pair of them in place of a transformer pair of coils. I'm not quite sure of that yet because there's one other area of concern that Paul Falstad deals with that I haven't solved yet. But let me hold that thought for a minute, because there is another area of his simulator that's very unique that I have solved already, and that's his lamps, his incandescent bulbs. They are specifically the Edison filament of carbonized bamboo in an evacuated bulb that has been vacuum evacuated of its air, vacuumed of its air. And you have a carbonized bamboo filament in there, and it becomes a generator of current at all times by applying any quantity of voltage to that lamp. But it creates the most amount of current, sending that current back to the circuit to which it is attached, if the incandescence of that filament starts to heat up and become luminous, especially when it reaches maximum luminosity of white light, which I believe is around 2700 degrees Kelvin temperature index for the color index of incandescent light bulbs to specify what level of luminosity you have reached. And Paul gives you the Kelvin figure, and I believe it's 2700 for incandescent light bulbs. And when I look at it, it looks pretty white and no longer yellow, certainly not orange or red or brown. So that was one thing I've already solved. Now, Irving Langmuir, after only about 8 or 9 years of Edison's discovery, came up with his own version, which is the one we mix up with Edison, that we ascribe to Edison when it has nothing to do with Edison. It's Irving Langmuir who came up with it. And it's the tungsten filament in a noble gas bulb, filled with a noble gas such as argon, let's say, which is the one originally used by Irving. So that's not an Edison invention. That's an Irving Langmuir invention, and it's to supersede Edison's because Edison's tends to burn out too readily. Maybe he didn't have the right equipment to create a perfect vacuum or a nearly perfect vacuum inside his bulb, because there are stories of Edison light bulbs in fire stations that are still running to this day. And I suppose they must have succeeded in getting the right filament, the right, length, the diameter, and blah, blah, blah. All the parameters of constructing an Edison bulb, they got it right. And maybe the whole purpose of the Irving Langmuir invention is to blame Edison for some of his earlier faulty versions that were made by cheap companies or made by Edison and somehow got through quality control and didn't last very long. Or make up a story that they didn't last. Make up a lie. That could be more likely. God forbid we should have a light bulb that lasts forever, and sends energy back to the grid. Because in those days, that was the only load, was light bulbs. They didn't have compressors running a refrigerator. They had no electric motors. All they had were light bulbs in residential areas that were sending current back to the grid. So that's what I think happened. Well, simulators don't have the Spice family of simulators. Now I'm moving on to the area that I had held off on. We're done with light bulbs. The other area of Paul Falstad that I touched on but didn't finish is that the Spice family of simulators, it tries to look ahead and then make a decision. How long should the time interval be that I do the computations for that will exhibit a certain behavioral characteristic of the design of the circuit within the subsequent time frame that I'm going to map out the simulation? And that variation of duration of time interval per time interval breaks up the resonance, the fluidic resonance of a circuit simulation. While Paul Falstad, because he has to cut corners and because he has to exhibit the behavior of the circuit while it's running, and you get to change it while it's running, he cut corners by saying, okay, you get to pick what time interval you want the simulation to run at, and it sticks with that while it's running. Now, you can change it, and you can get over unity just by changing the time step, or you can get comatose just by changing the time step, but it's consistently the same time step. Now, what that means is that if you design a circuit that's over unity, it may not exhibit over unity characteristics unless you change the time step to be in resonance with that circuit. And as you keep changing it one unit of time step at a time, let's say you've gotten it down to microseconds, okay, so you're going 7 microseconds, 6 microseconds, you keep whatever the unit is, or 7.5, whatever it is, because you get to specify. You'll find certain time intervals that will give you over unity and others that will not. You'll find some that are comatose. You'll find some that it will explode in your face. And you may, if you're lucky, find some that strobe. That was my first over unity circuit that strobed, was a lightning. I call it a lightning circuit. And I believe the first shortcut I made for it was tinyurl.com/hallelujah. I believe that hallelujah has a double L and it starts with H. And it has a J in there, not a Y. J-A-H, hallelujah, H-A-L-L-E-J-A-H. I believe that's how I spelled it. And it's a superb circuit. I did a whole web page on my website, and I linked to it from my mirrored versions of Paul Falstad's simulator because I really thought it was a superb discovery. It puts out about the same power level that San Onofre nuclear power plant used to put out, which is about the range of 10% of the lightning bolts that occur on this planet are that high range of power, in which I believe it's megaamps and possibly megavolts, but mine was a little higher. They were gigavolts. So it was megaamps and gigavolt strobe peaks that took something like 7 seconds to develop enough charge to release that charge in a peak and then collapse, or however it works. It probably works something along those lines. So it was a very slow strobe, but I had to up or increase the time interval to get to that functional behavioral characteristic of that circuit that was just waiting for me to discover it by raising the time step. And I had to raise it to something like 1 second or something, or half a second, something like, or 2 seconds, something like that, to get that result. So this is a different type of resonance. And Paul Falstad's simulator, bless his heart, bless him for coming up with such a unique gift to humanity that people who study free energy don't bother to fumble around with, to teach themselves electrical engineering in a manner that no other simulator can do, because he shows you the source code. You can go look at it and learn about electrical reactance, how he uses the formula of capacitive reactance and inductive reactance to figure out how the behavior of his coils and capacitors should behave, to give you an outcome, a result, when a voltage difference is applied to their two terminals of caps and coils. So that was, and you know, maybe he doesn't like it, you know, so he put an artificial limit, a cap of 1,000 amperes to his diodes, and then in the sidebar he makes a commentary in the adjacent to the source code that diodes can sometimes be weird, so I have to put this artificial cap here, this artificial limit. That was the first change, one of the first changes I made to my mirrored instance of his simulator, was to get rid of that limitation, because I want to see it soar to the heights. Because how else am I supposed to monkey around with a circuit design that's supposed to be over unity if I don't get the results that I want? And that's an artificial limitation that has no business being there. But to his credit, he is the most blessed electrical engineer trained in the artistry on this planet, because he innocently created a simulator that can teach us over unity if we take the trouble to fumble around by trial and error, to do whatever it takes to learn from our mistakes and our successes, what to do and what not to do. Because that's all mistakes do, is they teach you what not to do. You still have to have successes and fumble into the successes to learn what to do. But you will learn so much, and still to this day, 7 years later, I'm learning from his simulator, things I had never learned before, that I suspected, but I never put my attention on it because I thought, it's just a quirk of his simulator. No, it's a feature, it's a facet, it's a benefit that he has given to us on a silver platter, on a gold platter, on a platter of bliss, on a platter of enlightenment. He has given us the task to become enlightened on the topic of free energy just by giving us his simulator. This is what he has done. And the source code, so you can make your own version if you don't like his version the way he's done it. And that's what I did. So long as I could. Now I can't anymore. But as long as I could, I made changes to his simulator to be more in line with what I needed it to be. And it has helped. I couldn't have made the progress that I've made without those changes. But unfortunately, I can't make changes anymore. I don't have access to a computer that can compile his Java source code and convert it into JavaScript to have a browser host his simulator. So I'm stuck with the versions that I already developed. But I can still learn. And so now I'm learning about how to resonate a strobing over unity design by simply changing the frequency, the wavelength of his time step, which is also called time interval, but he calls it a time step, but it's also called time intervals in the SPICE family of simulators. So whether we call it time interval or a time step, it's the same deal, except his is the same for every interval, for every step. It doesn't change from one step to the next, from one interval to the next. And thus you can resonate the circuit, get it in touch with its internal resonance for over unity within any one of those three zones if your design is capable of going into any one of those three zones. Because you could have a circuit that cannot go into comatose. It can only explode. Or it cannot go into over unity and explode in your face. It can only be comatose. Let alone not even strobe. Those are two possibilities. You can design a circuit to do any one of those 3 zones and only one of those zones and not the other 2. Or just 2 of those zones in which normally it's the 2 extremes, explode or comatose. It's usually not the middle zone and 1 extreme. It never works that way. It's always the 2, if it's 2 zones, it's 2 extreme zones, comatose or explosion. And if you're lucky enough to get all 3, then you can get it to strobe. And I've done a few like that. In my latest text that I might have published separately on Amazon, I can't remember if I did or not. It's called Always On Spark Gap. I may have, but I've put it on my website for free and on PayHip and on ScribeD. And it's free on ScribeD. You just have to know. You got to, give if you want to take. So you give them something, a text file. It could be a shopping list. It doesn't matter what it is. It could be what you did today, or what you did yesterday. It can be anything. Just so long as you give something, then you can take something for free. So you don't have to pay them any money. Don't get that idea. Erase that idea from your head. They give you the option to download from their website for free. If you give them something for free, a text, something textual, something you've written that's your own and it's not somebody else's that you plagiarized. But you don't have to worry. You don't have to be a writer, a ham author. You can just write a shopping list for all they care. I've done that, trust me. I don't know, not recently, but I have done it in the past. Anyway, so I have to thank Paul. I can't thank Paul Falstad enough. He has given us a beautiful gem, a learning tool. Because you're not going to get this from any class or books. I mean, I don't really teach per se. I just flap my gums. And so I'm kind of disorganized by how I go about it. So you really don't get a nicely orchestrated or outlined or organized curricula presentation. You get a haphazard, blabbling from me. Or even my writing style, whatever book I come out with, So you're not going to get really a teaching course, but it's an introduction. We can call it that. Like I'm touching on the surface of things, and introducing you to the topic in general and maybe a few highlights here and there. But once in a while, I get this beautiful awakening in realizing what something needs to be said. So I need to give thanks and give credit where credit is due. Because Paul considers it a failure on his part whenever I show off what I can do with his simulator that it can give over Unity. I'm like an embarrassment to him. Because this is not what he was taught. And this is not what society deems appropriate. And he went to Cambridge. God, if you go to Cambridge, you're going to do what's appropriate, right? You're going to want to fit in with the crowd and get paid and have a good reputation. And what's this jerk over here? What's he doing trying to make me look like an asshole that I've given him a simulator that can perform these odd behavioral things that he calls weird, when in fact it's a hint of what's going to be happening in the future when more people get into this and start to study it instead of just haphazardly, oh, maybe I'll get lucky. I'll throw things together in the lab and see if I get lucky. You're not going to learn things that way. It'll take you lifetimes to learn that way. You have to get on a simulator to make all your mistakes, to increase the rate at which you make them, so as to increase the rate at which you stumble across an occasional success, and then learn from that occasional success what should be done, in addition to the things you learn from your mistakes not to do, in order to speed up your learning curve, because it'll take you lifetimes, multiple lifetimes, to learn just by building something. And there are people who have managed to learn something, but they're lucky. David Bowling is one of them. He's lucky. And his friend, I forget the first, Alan? Is it Alan French? His friend, Mr. French, between the two of them, they're lucky to have spent over a decade and a half of stumbling and bumbling and managed to come up with circuit designs that are over unity. But that's because they're lucky, and they're the lucky few who can do just by learning by trial and error in the physical realm of concrete reality of building a physical material circuit. They're the lucky ones. I'm not so lucky. So I had to speed up my learning curve by working with simulators. And I must say, Paul Falstad's the best. Now, there are certain simulators to avoid because they are specifically designed to uphold conservation of energy, and you will never, ever get over unity from them. Everycircuit.com is one of them. CircuitLab.com is another one. Forget it. Have fun being a normal engineer, but don't bother if you're trying to learn over unity. It won't happen. You've got to use either Microcap, Paul Falstad's, or LT Spice, and you can get over unity. The problem with LT Spice and, the problem with LT Spice is it explodes too readily. And you're not going to get a middle zone, no matter how hard you try. You'll either get comatose or you'll get explosion, and that's it. Well, at least with Microcap, you can get strobing, but only for the golden ratio circuit, as far as I know. And in Paul Falstad's, you can get strobing in other varieties of circuits because I haven't even been able to implement the golden ratio in his because he doesn't allow some of the things that Microcap allows. Having multiple inductors, have various differences of mutual inductance, unique. That's what makes it so difficult to figure out how to build a darn thing. How do you have multiple coils, 5 coils of 3 different mutual inductances? But it's predicated on the golden ratio, the properties, I should say, of the golden ratio. And Microcap allows for that. But LT Spice does not, as I believe, from what I recall. But Paul Falstad definitely does not allow for 5 coils with 3 different mutual inductances. So I don't know how to build it yet. And I'm not in a position to find out, quite frankly, because I don't have a desktop computer. I have to go to the public library, and I tried installing LT Spice or Microcap and on the public network of the public library system, and they cracked down on me, on all of us. And then they let it be known in no uncertain terms that they were paying attention to what I was doing. So, because I found a way, a back door to install software on their system when you normally are not supposed to be able to do that. I just stumbled across, I just innocently did it, not trying to break the system or break through or crack anything or hack anything. I just did things the way that their system taught me to do it. See? So, it all comes back to themselves. They have certain rules they follow, and it trained me to take certain precautionary measures in response. And the staff at the library told me so. Hey, what the hell are you doing it that way for? You could do it this other way. And I go, yeah, I'm such a dummy. I knew about that, but I didn't think it was necessary. But yeah, I ended up doing it. And that became the back door. So it's their own fault. But, they got to blame somebody else other than themselves. So, wow, whatever. Let it be on my shoulders, my guilt. Whoopie-doo. But I can't go there. So I can't find a way I can't find a way to implement the golden ratio circuit in Paul Falstad's simulator. But it's got enough questions there as it is. He's got a transformer that can pass DC. Okay, I may have solved that. He's got a light bulb that only harks back to the days of Edison and not Irving Langmuir, which is the style of incandescent light bulbs we are familiar with to this day, because it carried over to this day. Halogen light bulbs are the same way, really. They're pretty much the basic same design. as the Irving Langmuir design, but not the same as the Edison design. He went away and very fast. We no longer have light bulbs like Edison, so far as I know. I haven't looked for them on eBay yet, but you certainly can't buy them in the store. You'd have to make it yourself, basically. So Paul Falstad has a very unique simulator that does take some excruciating patience before you can figure all this shit out, and I made it easy for you because I figured out some of it already. But I still don't understand about the time step. What I told you is I think my theory, because I've seen it happen so many times. But I'm not really... I want to check it out some more today to see if what I'm theorizing or hypothesizing to you in this recording is correct or not. Can I get better results, more what I want, instead of the damn thing blowing up in my face? Because there's so many parameters to a circuit, and I only have so much time in each day to spend at the library, and then it's over, and I got to go work to earn a living, and then forget what I did the day before, because I have a short-term memory. I'm old, and it's not like before where I could do non-stop work night and day and be consistent in modifying a circuit and cover all the different bases, all the different parameters that I could possibly cover, and finally get a circuit that was over unity the way I wanted it. I don't get that. I have just a few hours in each day, and that's it. And so it takes a lot of time to learn by trial and error, because most of the time is error. And it means it's very difficult, but stretched out over several days, I think about it at the end of the day. Okay, what could I have done differently? Because I'm depressed. I figure, oh shit, I've exhausted all the options. No, I haven't. I haven't even scratched the surface for that particular circuit that I'm working on at any given moment, because I can only spend so few hours each day to work. When I have so many other things I got to be doing. I got to work on writing about it, document what I'm doing, take screenshots. It takes time to do all this shit. Read my emails, pay bills. Oh, God. But I had this little insight, and I think I have enough backlog of experience now to feel qualified in mentioning it. Because I wouldn't want to mention it if I didn't feel like, there seems to be a pattern here. And that's resonance, but of a different type than what we're taught. It has nothing to do with impedance matching whatsoever, in the sense that we're taught impedance matching. Now, in a sense, it does have to do with impedance matching, but not really, because it has to do with Foster's reactance theorem. It still deals with capacitive reactance and inductive reactance and frequency and resistance, but in a different way. Instead of trying to look for efficiency, we're looking for Foster's reactance theorem and the three different zones of negative impedance that are possible. So low that it's comatose, that it's not worth mentioning practically. Too high that it's of any use because the circuit blows up. And that difficult but not impossible middle zone of strobing. It really has to do with Foster's reactance theorem. It has nothing to do with the simplistic notion of impedance matching, which is a very simplistic idea of resonance of electrical reactance. Yet still, this is a more sophisticated version of the resonance aspect of electrical reactance, okay? And it's covered by Foster's reactance theorem per se, but not really, because Foster's reactance theorem doesn't tell you how to go about it. It doesn't tell you all the particulars that I'm telling you. So, whatever. Because it's the nonlinear dynamic that is sequestered, that we're not supposed to learn about. So, of course. Of course Foster's reactance theorem wouldn't cover it. Duh. All right, I've said enough. Got a little politics there, ended on a political note. Whatever.